Hi guys, we are at last deep into spring, even here at the foot of the Alps. Finally. And so it finally feels like time for me to make a recommendation video about a kind of book, a kind of story that I've realized I've had a lot of success with reading in the past, especially in the last year. And while the stories in this type of book aren't necessarily set in spring, they still feel like springtime books to me because there is a certain openness to them and a certain outdoorsy feeling to the story, which I think is very fitting for spring. I call these books, these stories, these novels, small town symphonies. They aren't just stories set in small towns, because that is an awfully common setting, and any video in which I recommend any number of books set in small towns, be they 5 books, 10 books, 15 books, wouldn't have much more in common than the small town setting, which in my opinion isn't enough to bind them together or to justify making a themed video about them. No, what I mean by small town symphonies is books in which the story is narrated in such a way that it feels as if the whole town is speaking, or that everybody gets a word in, or gets a perspective in at least, or is the focus of the story at some point in the story. And that can be realized in different ways, as you will see when I talk about my books one by one. But the result is always the same. It's like a tapestry of storylines, or a symphony of voices. My first book is Reservoir 13 by Jon McGregor. This story has as its point of departure the disappearance and likely murder of a teenaged girl in a small village in the Peak District in England. And this awful event makes the whole town, the whole village, freeze in time. The incident affects everybody in one way or another, or the fallout from the incident does. And everybody's life is either put on hold or turned upside down. And it takes a while for life to get back to normal in certain aspects, or for new ways of life, new ways of living to develop and come into their own in the town, depending on how deeply the person in question was affected by the fallout from the incident. But as time goes on, the wheel of the year turns always faster and faster as the new way of living becomes the new normal, and the awful incident, the memory, grows smaller and smaller in the collective memory of the town. And this aspect in particular, the passing of time and the receding image of the event in the rear view mirror, so to speak, is extremely well done in this book. And as you get further on and on in the book, reading it feels more and more meditative almost. Or you feel like you are watching a time-lapse video of the life of a town. It is important to know beforehand, I think, that it is a very quiet, very contemplative book. It is not a murder mystery. It's not a detective story. The disappearance of the girl is really just the point of departure for the telling of the story of this town. My second book is Summer Light and Then Comes the Night by Jon Stefansson, here in the German translation. In this novel set in rural Iceland, the town collective actually narrates the story, calling themselves we, and it is never precisely clear who that we is or are at any given moment. It's always a different number and a different assortment of people, you can assume, depending on who the story is about that is being told in each chapter. The book tells the interwoven, interweaving life stories of the people in town, or stories of the people in town at different key points in their lives, and While each chapter is focused on more or less one protagonist, the story always takes up threads from earlier, later on in the book and weaves them together. So it's not like they are interlocking short stories. And this is also, again, just a very quiet story about normal people living their lives and trying as best they can to live them well and to live them happily. And they're sometimes getting it right, sometimes getting it wrong, while above them the indifferent stars shine on and on in the vastness of the universe, untouchable and unknowable. As I said just now, this is a very realistic story, or stories, and the people in these stories act in very realistic, very human ways. Ways that the more judgmental readers, I guess, will take offense at because they don't approve if a piano doesn't immediately fall from heaven and strike the offensive character down. If you can't handle the absence of this kind of divine judgment, maybe stick to a different corner of the bookshop. Book number 3 is Lanny by Max Porter. In this story, a young boy, Lanny, falls into a hole and gets lost in a small town, or a settlement rather, in London's commuter belt, the suburbs, where they fell the trees and then name the streets after them. In this novella, the story isn't so much narrated as rather mediated through the spirit of the place, the genius loci, if you like. And this being an English story, there is a bit of the old folk tale of the Green Man in this spirit as well. But this Green Man has taken on a bit of a grotesque form because he has incorporated into it himself, or itself, all the changes that have been done to its habitat, and that includes the concrete with all its ugliness, and the dirt and the rubbish that people drop, like cigarette butts and bottle caps and all those nice things. And all these things are these objects, but also all the impressions of what is going on and what people are saying. The spirit imbibes and regurgitates and then almost spits out at the reader. Sometimes this can take the form of a more or less coherent narrative, and sometimes it's really just expressions, like snippets of speech, things that people have said, which are just presented as they are without any kind of contextualization. It is quite a trippy book and quite a fast-paced read, and just the perfect short read for a day out in the park. My last 2 books are both German, but they've both been translated into several languages, English among them. The first one is Dunkelblum by Eva Menasse. The English title, Darkenbloom, makes it sound rather gothic, I think, which it couldn't be further from, in atmosphere or in spirit or in subject matter. It is a historical novel with a frame narrative that is set in 1989, but it is about a war crime that happened at the end of the Second World War, and it is about how this crime happened and how it was treated, or not treated rather, afterwards. There are many different players in this story, both in the year 1989 and in the 1930s and 40s. And 50s and 60s and 70s, really. And the story goes over each of them, and it feels like it zooms in on them with a magnifying glass, one after the other. It is at the same time a very sharp-witted, very humorous story, and a very kind one. It was one of my top 3 favorite reads of last year. I completely forgot to hold up Dunkelblum. I don't know what I was thinking. Probably nothing. Never mind. And my fifth and last book is Vor dem Fest by Sasa Stanisic, Before the Feast in English. This is the story of the goings-on of one night in a small town in Brandenburg in northeastern Germany. It is the night before the Feast of Saint Anne, which is a very important date in the calendar of the town, maybe the only important day in the year in the town. And this one somewhat creepy, somewhat eerie, very busy night comprises the whole history of the town in a nutshell, in a fashion. This is the second most trippy book in this little stack after Lanny, or maybe it is even more trippy than Lanny, considering that it goes on for much longer. It is also, I think, maybe it might be the most charming German book that I have ever read. A small caveat though, I think much of its charm and definitely much, if not all of its humor, depend on the reader being familiar with the cultural and political and socio-economic setting that the story is set in. But you know what, I don't really know. Maybe it works the other way around too. Perhaps you can learn something about the setting from this book, and perhaps you'll enjoy it just as much as somebody who has that background. So these are my 5 small town symphonies that I have enjoyed in the last few years. If you know other examples of this type of story, do let me know in the comments. I'll see you again soon, guys. Enjoy the spring weather or the mild autumn weather if you're on the other side of the world from me. Bye.